I have a whole bunch of these interesting offcuts, whether they're bark inclusion on a slab that I've cut down, or a burl that's been sliced, or stuff that I've collected over the years that's either just a little bit wrong for a project, isn't really useful for a project. I'd set it aside as either carving stock or turning stock or something like that, and I've just never gotten around to it. I also have a whole bunch of this epoxy and a couple of other small brands of epoxy that it's just left over. I had it for a particular project. This was the smallest size I could get, and it's just sitting there. I don't, to be perfectly honest, I don't really like epoxy, but I can't exactly pour this down the drain or drink it, so I need to find a way to use it up in a project. So I'm going to combine the two. Bought some silicone molds off eBay to try and combine the two and use them both up in one hit. First thing was to resaw the weird blanks down into slices just slightly thicker than the mold. With it resawn, it's not going to fit into the mould. These are nominally 100mm, that's what they're sold as, so just a hair under 4 inches, but it doesn't actually specify what dimension that is. I found that the outside's about 105, so closer to 4 inches. The inside is just a hair underneath that, it's about 99.5mm. If you are very careful with a pair of calipers, you can just get that inside measurement. You just have to be very gentle with it, because it being silicone, it does tend to deform when you're trying to measure it. Ideally, you want to get as close as possible so that epoxy isn't going to leak around the sides. If it does, it's not the end of the world. It's only going to be quite a small amount, but the closer you are, the better. With those pieces cut, they now will likely fit across the width of the mould quite well, but when we push it right into the corners, you can see that because there's a radius internally, there's one externally too, but we only care about the internal one, they don't go all the way down to the bottom, which is a bit of a shame. There are a couple of ways you could address this. The first is, I was going to go to the bench sander. The problem is with just the small radius, it's really easy to get close, but consistency can be a bit of an issue. Not a huge deal, but can just be a little bit fiddly. You could also use a file or rasp or even just sandpaper, sanding the corners off. That would work well. However, I found that the radius of this is pretty close to a 1/4 inch radius, but it's probably a 5mm or 6mm radius that I actually need. So we can use that bit with the piece vertical to put that round over on. Now this would be dangerous to just push through the rattle like so. So using a larger block of wood, that's our reference up against the fence. The fence is in line with the bearing. This piece is secure. We can take a pass pushing the whole block forward, and that'll cut the round over. The block will also act as a backer so that there is less chance of any tear out. Shouldn't be a great deal of tear out anyway, but always nice to reduce that. And then we get perfectly consistent between all the pieces, and it's just a much nicer, quicker process. Make sure to remove all the bark if it's a live edge or has a bark inclusion. The bark is a weak point, any moisture in that could cause it to fall off, and if that's all that the epoxy is adhering to, you could be in for a bad time. The resin I'm using is a 2:1 by volume epoxy. This particular epoxy, if you want to use it by weight, is approximately 1.7 to 1. To work out how much epoxy I'd need, it's a pretty simple calculation. Width by length by depth multiplied by 4 for the 4 moulds I have. I'm estimating the wood portion average out to be about half the mould, so it works out about 50mm by 100mm by 8mm. That gives me 40,000 cubic millimeters or 40 millilitres each, or 160 millilitres total. I just rounded that down to 100 millilitres of resin and 50 millilitres of hardener because those ticks are on the side of the cup. After thorough mixing of parts A and B, the dye can be added. Once the epoxy is poured into the moulds, I'm adding some extra colour in the form of gold and copper pigments. These usually sink to the bottom, which is why I'm adding them and swirling them in last. Heat can help pop surface bubbles to varying degrees of success. With the coasters dried and out of the moulds, I need to clean up the epoxy and reduce the thickness of the wood section. The easiest way for me is to run these through the drum sander. They're secured to a board of plywood with superglue and blue tape, so I can run them all through at once. A thicknesser could also be used if you're taking very delicate cuts. While still attached to the board, I used an orbital sander to work through the finishing grits, from 80 up to 220 grit. .220 grit isn't a high enough grit for epoxy to look good, so they received further hand sanding with Micromesh. Micromesh is best suited to plastics and requires wet sanding. You can see the debris being carried away in the water. For the finish, Livos Kunos benchtop oil was on hand, so that's what I used, and it really makes the blackwood glow. To make these more coastery, I purchased some cork pre-cut to 95mm square with adhesive on one side. I'm pretty happy with how these have turned out. I would have liked some more of the swirling to have made it through, but for whatever reason the pigment didn't sink. Every other time I've used the copper and gold pigment, it's always sunk to the bottom. So I thought, oh yeah, this time it'll be great. I'll just take off that top layer and be able to see it. Of course, that didn't work out. Still looks pretty good. For a lot of the more crafty projects that I've done, I almost always get asked, how much did it cost? And that is a bit of a tricky question. In terms of raw material, it's pretty easy to figure out how much it costs. So we take the volume of the epoxy, using the epoxy I've already got, which was the 3-litre kit. It works out at about $1, something like 98 cents of epoxy per caster. Now that doesn't include the cost of the pigments, but you use very little of that. And the cork worked out at about 38 cents each for one of those squares. Now you could buy it in a roll cheaper or something that's not self-adhesive backed, but this was available and it wasn't too bad. So I'm going to say it costs about $2 per coaster. Now where that gets a little bit tricky is that's not how much I've overall spent on it. I had to buy a box of 80 to get these cork things, so for just 4 it's more than 38 cents each. To get the moulds, they cost, well, really however much you want to pay, depending on how many moulds you want to get, what shape you want to get, how long you're willing to wait. And again, the pigments, the wear and tear on abrasives and other tools, and having those tools. So best case, it costs about $2 Australian per coaster, up to about $70 per coaster if you're only doing one coaster and buying all the stuff. As I said, I was using up the resin, so that doesn't really count. I've already bought this stuff. They've been used on other projects, so it's a bit of a sunk cost. Either way, I'm pretty happy with it. The only downside is that Mum has seen these now and she wants a set. And I do have a little bit of epoxy left, but I'm kind of hoping that I don't have to buy more epoxy doing this as a project to use up epoxy. Thanks for watching.